On your mark.
On your mark.
Get set.
Get set.
Now ready.
Ready, go.
Provocative, engaging, and usually quite a lady.
Okay, they're asking for it.
So I've determined affirmative action to be basically a shiny object, and that's because most students, most Black students, most white students aren't going to highly selective colleges and universities. And that is where affirmative action for Blacks has been mostly applied. So why have I called it the shiny object? It's because, quite simply, a shiny object, it is devised to take your eyes off the big picture. And what is the big picture? The big picture is the deplorable state of education, particularly public education, but I dare say, increasingly we're also looking at private schools. And if that's what the parents want, then so be it. But when we're talking about public education, we are in big trouble. I think a great way to start part 2 of this podcast is to take a listen at newly elected Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. This is from 2018. And Brandon Johnson, he's speaking at I'm going to call it a community meeting. It was hosted by Midwest Socialist. It's at a library in Chicago. Speaking, Bill Ayers, former domestic terrorist, former member of the Weather Underground. And of course, he went on to teach for years at the University of Illinois, and of course, a great mentor to former President Barack Obama. Also, Mark Warren, organizer, and they're socialists, just plain and simple. And then there was Brandon Johnson. The reason I want you to listen to this, and the whole thing is like an hour and 8 minutes, I'm just going to give you a snippet. The most pertinent part is Brandon Johnson's views on education and the role he took, how he conducted himself as a teacher in Chicago public schools. This clip starts with an attendee asking him a question.
I wanted to ask, do your own personal philosophy of education conflicts with your workspace? And if it does, how do you kind of monitor and gauge that?
It's a great question. Yes, it always does. I taught at Westinghouse, Westinghouse is a selective enrollment school. That is in conflict with my philosophy, right? It's actually a contradiction. It's hypocritical. I'm teaching in a structure that actually weeds out a certain element of my neighborhood. So yes, I quit. No, it's tough. I mean, I think that happens in a lot of our spaces. For me, one of the ways in which I would deal with it was I believe I had an additional responsibility to challenge those of us who taught in selective enrollment schools. So one of the things that I did personally, it's why I began to really push for like opting out and not buying into the standardization of our public schools. Sometimes my colleagues actually had a tough time with the way that I taught. I spent less time offering tests to my students. They were frustrated. I taught at a selective enrollment school, much like I taught at a neighborhood school, where I use a lot of inquiry base, and I would challenge my honor students in particular to think beyond whatever it is they're able to remember, that their ability to just regurgitate. But I also, had to challenge myself seeing a school within a school system that provides more for a particular segment of our population is most frustrating, because when those students succeed at a selective enrollment, particularly Black students, what ends up happening is all other Black students who don't meet those same standards get shamed. right? See, so-and-so made it out. What's your problem? Like, how come you can't do it? These students are doing it. And so what it taught me, though, was pushing, like, to eliminate sort of the standardization of our public schools. My students sometimes would get frustrated. I didn't offer any test prep. Many of my other colleagues were doing it at the time. I was pushing our administration to move away from that. To be quite frank with you, I didn't issue a lot of homework for students. That was my own way of sort of rebelling against the structure. I don't think I ever gave a kid an F. I don't know how a student sits in front of you and fails. I know some professors may find that, it's slightly troubling because you've probably seen other things, but
not the professors in this
no,
room.
Of course
we're all
not,
with
right?
you. We're there.
So I mean, and I think the last thing is, it actually gave me that much more motivation to actually leave the classroom and become a full-time organizer with the CTU.
If you are thinking that Brandon Johnson was merely an outlier, that, man, nobody was doing that, well, please think again. This has been happening across the country, and it didn't just start happening, but it has been ramped up significantly. The decline in American education is real, and I think we all know that. We have to ask ourselves questions, though. Why are so many schools across the country banning homework, banning grades, banning recognition for attendance and academic achievement? This is what he was talking about in 2018, but I tell you, this has been going on for a little longer than that. Why are so many public schools now prohibiting teachers from giving students a score of less than 50% on homework, no matter what, even if no homework is turned in or if the work was plagiarized? Yeah, that's happening too. In California, several large school districts, including Los Angeles, they still allow grades, but only A's, B's, and C's. And if you doubt what I'm saying, just try this little exercise. Google eliminating grades in schools. It's called ungrading. That's what the term is, I guess, in educational circles. In Alexandria, Virginia, at the Thomas Jefferson High School, the administration, they withheld National Merit Award notifications from the students who earned them, and also from their families. So consequently, these high-achieving, hardworking students who had earned a National Merit Scholarship Award, they didn't know they had achieved this. Their parents didn't know. So when they were applying for college and trying to get other scholarships, they couldn't mention that. They couldn't mention that they were National Merit Scholars. They couldn't mention it because they didn't know. They didn't know just how successful they had been. All because the administration didn't want non-high achieving students to feel bad. They said, we want to recognize students for who they are as individuals. All of this accomplishment stuff, it's for the birds. Kind of sound familiar? When Brandon Johnson, he talked about, he did away with the books, the work. He went to a more inquiry-based education. I'll ask you some questions about life. I'll ask you some questions about the things you should know. Then I won't test you on it, so don't worry about it. There'll be no test prep. These kids aren't learning. And this is not just an incident. This is happening all over the place. And I mentioned earlier that it's not just public schools. Also, predominantly white and predominantly wealthy schools, many of them are dropping grades. There was a 2022 article in Independent School Magazine, and it says, our traditional practice of grading everything students do inadvertently sows distrust and shame and deceit. You see where we're going here? And I'm not picking on Brandon Johnson. He's just one of many examples, but that's exactly what he said. when he pointed out the high achievers, how they, people hold them up and it makes the other kids feel ashamed. This is the philosophy of far too many in our educational system today. And more importantly, the people who helm all of this. He said it. He said, I decided then, hey, I'd be far more valuable as an organizer. Get in the union, organize the teachers. Let's move this thing ahead. He said earlier, he was rebelling against the system. It was his personal agenda. Well, it actually isn't his personal agenda. It is the agenda of many. It is the agenda of many. Remove the standards. Take away the grading. Ungrade kids. Dumb them down. Make them think they're being educated. Make their families think they're being educated. Go ahead, graduate them. But remove their abilities in terms of analyzing and thinking for themselves. And we have to ask ourselves, why are they doing this? I guess you can ask 1,000 people that question, why are they doing this? You may get, 1,000 different answers. The reason I think this is happening is because it's really about control. It's about control. Parents have inherent natural rights. We have those rights with regards to the upbringing of our children, the moral values, and their education. But increasingly, what I can only call this administrative state, they really are usurping these rights. And the outcome clearly is not good. It's not going to get better either. If the state is dictating the values of your children, the moral compass of your children, if they are instilling the values, if they are determining what's good, what's bad, what is immoral, what is moral, whether they can read or whether they can write or whether they cannot, you've got a problem. You've got a big problem. And if you just step back for a moment, that's exactly what's happening. It's exactly what's happening. So when you have the state, the government, controlling key aspects of your children's upbringing, or at least having a very heavy hand in these things, then they will just naturally go with whatever the government says. That sounds like a stretch, I know, to some of you, but it's really not a stretch because they won't have the capacity to reason, to think independently. Your way of thinking, your morals, your values will ultimately be rejected. So, yeah, that's why I think this is happening. Before we wrap up the podcast today, there are a couple of other things I want to do. One, I want to run down a few numbers. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to let another guy do it. But we want to run down some numbers so you can get a really good glimpse of the landscape, the educational landscape. And then there's some solutions. We'll take a look at those as well. But first,
last year, 2022, the National Assessment of Educational Progress showed that nationwide only 32% of America's fourth graders were reading at grade level. That means they were actually literate at the fourth grade level, which means they are actually able to read to learn effectively at the fourth grade level. It's crazy. Only 32% of our kids. In Wisconsin, when you look at our state assessment, only 35% of children in the third grade who completed third grade, this test was given in April of 2022, March, April, only 35% were reading proficiently, meaning they were capable of reading to learn at the third grade level. And at the end of third grade in American education, we switched from teaching children how to read, kindergarten through third grade, to teaching them, to read to learn. So kids have to have some foundational skills by the time they finish third grade. What it showed was that literally 65% of our kids in Wisconsin, third graders overall, aren't cutting it. Worse, only 8% of Black children in Wisconsin are reading at grade level. Only 8% of third graders. That's crazy. When you look fast forward to high school, only 8% of the students that are in high school who complete the ACT in Wisconsin, because the majority of our kids are supposed to complete that, only 8% are considered proficient on the ACT, which by their standards means that a child has, I think it's 75% chance or better of getting a C or better on their entry level language arts classes, English language arts classes in college. Only 8%. So that means 92% across the pipeline can barely read, y'all. And most of them, when you look at the data, can barely read at all. That's happening right now.
That was Colleen Kerr, founder and director of One City Schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And, just listening to him, it made me wonder what's going on nationwide. Can I just get a super quick glimpse? So I have it in my phone, so I'm going to be kind of looking back and forward here. But according to our nation's report card, that's what they call it, from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, boy, things are not looking too good. According to them, for fourth graders nationwide, lower fourth grade reading scores in 30 states. No states or jurisdictions scored higher from 2019 to 2022. 30 states or jurisdictions scored lower, and 22 states had no significant change. When you look at eighth grade, well, the eighth grade scores, one state or jurisdiction scored higher, 33 states lower, and 18 states had no significant change. Yeah, we've got big problems. There's been a lot of talk about, how the pandemic really set our kids back. And yes, it did. But for a lot of these schools, those numbers were horrible before the pandemic. They absolutely were. In the great state of Illinois, there are 30 schools where not one kid can read at grade level. And we want to talk about, oh my gosh, if we don't have affirmative action, how are these kids? This is crazy. Not a single student can do math at grade level in 53 schools in Illinois. Not a single kid. Yet, Chicago Public Schools, they have been boasting about historic graduation rates. 86%, I thought I saw. It was upper 80s, 86%. I'm not understanding this. First of all, only 11% are proficient in math. And these are the Black students, by the way, with the 11%. In the entire school system in Chicago, how is it? And then a similar number in reading. So how is it possible that they are touting their successful graduation rates? Well, clearly you know what's happening. They're just passing them along, passing them through. That is my take on affirmative action. If you want to keep talking about, oh my God, what's going to happen? What's these kids? They're just not going to have futures, because you're solely focusing on these highly selective schools. And everybody's been mum about what's really happening for the average child. And I can't stress enough, please, don't think it's just Black kids. Black kids' numbers are by far the worst, followed by Hispanics, then whites. But it's happening everywhere. Everybody's eyes are always diverted and forcefully diverted. Look over there at that shiny object. No, look over there at that shiny object. And, I really would be remiss if I didn't do two things. One, I really have to share with you what Randi Weingart, who is the head of the American Teachers Federation, what she had to say about the Supreme Court decision. And I'm going to read it verbatim. Make no mistake, today's draconian ruling by the Supreme Court is a catastrophic decision that will have dire outcomes for millions of Americans for decades to come. This decision ignores the original sin of this country. It's a throwback to a cruel, racist past that admissions policies like this tried to repair. This decision doesn't simply end affirmative action. It has huge consequences for public life far beyond higher education. Ignoring the facts before them, the majority pretends that both discrimination and the effects of discrimination simply do not exist and do not need to be tackled. End quote. Randy Weingarten, head of the American Teachers Federation. How dare her? I mean, seriously, why are these students failing? I have never heard Randy Weingarten utter a word about our nation's failing schools, and I certainly haven't heard her offer any plans to help turn things around. Why not call for a blue ribbon panel, a blue ribbon commission? That's what politicians do. And at least bring in outsiders and let them examine what's going on. No, her focus has been, will continue to be, the unions. Where else in the world can anyone make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for a quarter of a century, no less, and fail miserably? Where's that? Where does that happen? That is crazy. This is not against teachers. It's about a failed and corrupt system and failed and corrupt people such as Weingarten, who know full well that these children, they are walking down a path to an extremely bleak future. At what point the NAACP, the Black Caucus, and many, many others, when are they going to speak up? It's all politics. It's all social engineering. Wrapping it up, what are the solutions? Well, the solutions clearly don't include bringing back affirmative action. Turnaround doesn't take a long time. I told you earlier in part one of this that I did my own turnaround. What I didn't mention was when I got to that junior college, the very first semester, I went on probation. It was too much for me, too much freedom. By that second year, so another semester, and then by the second year, I was on the president's list. Skip the dean's list. I was on the president's list, invited to have dinner at the president's place, not the president of the United States, but of the college. Because my straight A's brought me to that table. But it was only because I had been given proper instruction. The bar had been raised significantly because the purpose of that school was, if you wanted to go further, you could walk with your head up. And it did that. Nobody's talking about doing that. But there are some things that can be done. There are some things we can do to change this. And I think the simplest and first thing that we can do as parents is just to get involved on a personal level, making a call, making a phone call, stopping once or twice a week if you have the time. And I say that not because I'm busy watching, no, because maybe you're commuting back and forth to work, but making your presence known more, emailing. Sometimes it's just not possible. Emailing, setting up a time when we can talk on the phone during your lunch break. These small things are really, really important, though. They really, really are. And organized involvement. 3 or 4 moms attend these meetings. When our children, when they were small, the one school that they went to, it was amazing. How many parents would show up for the parent-teacher meetings at the night, the PTA or whatever it was called then. So many parents would show up. So many people would have questions and want answers and were just involved. And I love that school. So I know it makes a difference because the administrators and the teachers, they feel appreciated, that you appreciate what they're doing. And it's just the way that works. But there are other things. We've got to shake ourselves loose from the idea that we need our public schools to have as many children as they can because that's the only way we can get more funding for our public schools. Chicago public schools, they spend so much money, and I'm sorry I don't have that number in front of me, but it's, I think, second or third highest in the state. And I'm even talking, everybody likes to point to, well, at New Trier up on the North Shore. Let's not go there. Let's not do that. Because we don't want to sit down and compare SAT scores with that school, do we? No, we don't. But for almost every other place in the entire state, Chicago spends a ton of money. And what's the ROI? It's very little. And it has no business being like this. So we need to be more open to, pushing politicians, elected officials to consider giving us more options. I am open for vouchers. Definitely. I think that's real. I remember when there was a lot more talk about the voucher system, critics would always say it's just going to take the money out of the struggling schools. Well, quite frankly, if very few kids are reading and in some schools 0 kids are proficient in math or reading, you don't need money. You're not doing anything with it. And then, of course, there's homeschooling. And I know that was the other thing. The critics would always say, well, you don't want to homeschool your child because if you homeschool your child, they're going to be antisocial. They're not going to know how to interact with other people and blah, blah, blah. Totally not true. We even did homeschooling not long, but for about a year, just to help our daughter. But my dear friend Eber, she was always a proponent of don't put your son in school or son or daughter, I believe she used to say, early. Keep them at home an additional year or 2. Homeschool. And that's right. Take a listen to this report. It's not a very long report, but it's a really interesting report.
Black parents have pulled their children from public school in droves post-pandemic, according to the research, says William James, professor of education at Cal State Long Beach. He says there's been a steady decline in enrollment at public schools across the board, but especially among African American students.
The U.S. Census Bureau does report that homeschooling is way up. And this is among all races combined. Maybe it's up about 60% or so versus pre-pandemic levels. But for African Americans in particular, the number has quadrupled, even quintupled.
Still, he feels there's no reason to panic when reading about declining enrollment, as 86.5% of our children still attend public schools compared to the whopping 91% pre-pandemic, among the highest rate in the world. Locally, LAUSD saw a drop of over 20,000 students from 2021 to 2022, according to the California Department of Education. Of those, 13% were Black. Robin isn't surprised, often telling the moms in a Facebook group she moderates that even as an event planner and business owner, homeschooling is a viable option.
You can catch your kid up really quickly with like one-on-one attention. It's very, very hard for them to hide when it's just you and them. Like if it's a classroom of 30 kids, like it's easy for them to hide and slip through the cracks.
Not a chance here. Under an eye so watchful, even her 1-year-old is way ahead of the curve.
Excellent.
And that report was from Spectrum News. Just a footnote on the homeschooling issue. There's an article in Forbes. It's from February, and I came across it again, and it really does reemphasize the increase in homeschooling, particularly post-COVID. They say that it increased homeschooling 5.7% in the spring of 2020 to 9.7% in the fall of 2020 for white families. For Asian children, homeschooling rates increased from 4.9 to 8.8. So in both of those areas, almost doubling during that same time frame. For Blacks, that number rose from 3.3 in the spring of 2020 to 16.1 in the fall of 2020.
Excellent.
Now, it's important to say this. For some Black parents, they have issues with how schools discipline their children, particularly their sons. Some of them don't like the way history is being taught. So they have other reasons. But the real story there is that homeschooling amongst Blacks really has gone up about 5 times what it was. And it was actually not far off from whites or Asians in the first place. That's impressive, and that's a good thing, because if we don't get more competition, and that is by way of having a voucher to take your kid somewhere else, private school, a charter school or something, if you don't homeschool your child, these numbers are not going to get any better. And just some food for thought. As we watch the systemic deconstruction of the American educational system, and that's simply what we're watching, think about the words of Thomas Jefferson, which I'm going to happily share. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be.
And I will confront another form of bias, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Several months ago, I visited Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, where African Americans confronted injustice and white Americans confronted their conscience. In 43 years, we have come so far in opening the doors of our schools. Yet today we have a challenge of our own. While all can enter our schools, many, too many, are not learning there. There is a tremendous gap of achievement between rich and poor, white and minority. This too leaves a divided society. And whatever the causes, the effect is discrimination. My friend Phyllis Hunter of Houston, Texas, calls reading the new civil right. Equality in our country will remain a distant dream until every child of every background learns so that he or she may strive and rise in this world. No child in America should be segregated by low expectations, imprisoned by illiteracy, abandoned to frustration and the darkness of self-doubt.